I'm sure you've seen the numerous accounts praising Nolan's Odyssey as a masterpiece. Everybody seems to have a moment or element that they can point to as proof that this is Nolan's greatest achievement. But the problem is, when you zoom out and look at the film as a whole, you're confronted with a glaring issue. Nolan's Odyssey is a confused mess. A tangled web of incomplete ideas marked by a lack of narrative and thematic commitment. Nolan's Odyssey is not profound. It's incoherent. Now, to be clear, there isn't an inherent problem with taking an ancient epic like the Odyssey and using it as a canvas to tell your own story. Adaptation requires evolution, and we aren't going to sit here and go scene by scene and point out or dissect every single change that has been made from the original text. You have to treat Nolan's film and Homer's poem as fundamentally different works, and I feel like it should have been obvious to everyone from the beginning that they would not be similar. The problem isn't that Nolan changed the story. The problem is that the specific elements of the Odyssey he felt obligated to keep actively undermine his own modern ideas, while his modern ideas simultaneously destroy the core meaning inherent to Odysseus' story. Nolan didn't just adapt Homer's poem. He tried to force the ancient myth into his absolute favorite trope. The brooding, guilt-ridden protagonist who does terrible things for the greater good while pouting through the entire film. We've seen this guy before. Oppenheimer builds the bomb and feels terrible about it. Cobb enters the dream world and feels terrible about it. Bruce Wayne takes a fall for Harvey Dent, hides in a cave, and feels terrible about it. That archetype works when you're building a grounded superhero trilogy or a high-concept sci-fi thriller. But when you strip away Odysseus' vanity, ego, and tactical pride to turn him into a modern, trauma-plagued soldier, you set two contradictory frameworks at war with one another. What you end up with is a film where in order to actually appreciate it, you have to actively zoom in past the structural incoherence. You have to selectively pick and choose the isolated themes you like and ignore how they collide with the plot. Because the second you step back and view the movie as a cohesive whole, the entire thing falls apart. In this video, we're going to discuss how directors like Christopher Nolan are skating by on spectacle over substance, how Nolan is able to hide behind ambiguity, and how Nolan's intended message is undermined by the Odyssey plot points he feels obligated to hit.
Christopher Nolan is obviously known for creating some visually stunning films. He prides himself on finding inventive ways around relying on CGI and green screens. His commitment to the process of filmmaking is one of the things that moviegoers love about him. He tends to film on location and creates giant spectacle experiences like The Odyssey, which is filmed fully on 70mm IMAX cameras. The cameras used were such a big deal that they became a central part of the marketing for The Odyssey. The thing is, no one was concerned about how The Odyssey was going to look, but I think it's easy for audiences to get swept up in this spectacle and forget to ask, did that actually work? Cinematic spectacle and technical competence can cover up a lot, including a lack of coherence. Nolan's issue has never been about making something look grand or beautiful. The criticism has usually centered on his dialogue and exposition, and whether his ideas lead to a cohesive story. And this isn't just a Nolan problem. We've seen other directors get away with this as well. Steven Spielberg is known for his dynamic camera work, lighting, and creating emotionally driven cinema. In Disclosure Day, you can clearly see Spielberg's influence with the lighting and long, fluid camera shots, where characters move seamlessly through complex physical spaces, which for some covers up the massive issues in storytelling and the dull, repetitive nature of the film. I think this is a result of an audience starving for films that look cinematic. Directors like Christopher Nolan and Steven Spielberg, who understand lighting techniques, film blocking, and are willing to film on location and use practical effects, are becoming increasingly rare. Many films today have that streaming aesthetic. They're characterized by their flat lighting, homogenized color grading, and have become overly reliant on CGI or filming on volume stages. So when a director takes the time to create something with clear visual intent, something that feels immersive and revolutionary, it automatically creates a sense of awe. Nolan knows that the audience will bridge the gaps and rationalize the cognitive leaps because the audience respects the creative labor that went into making the scene possible. To shoot an entire epic on specialized 70mm cameras across global locations demands respect. The craft commands so much reverence that narrative incoherence is recontextualized by critics as bold artistic choices.
To understand why Nolan's narrative breaks down, you have to look at the central character change that sets the whole thing in motion. During press tours, Nolan famously leaned on Emily Wilson's translation, citing her opening line, "Tell me about a complicated man," as inspiration for his Odyssey. The problem is, Nolan's Odysseus is not that complicated. And this isn't just our sentiment. This is an observation shared by Emily Wilson herself. And it's not about whether or not you like Emily Wilson or her translation. It's the fact that Nolan went out of his way to promote her version as the inspiration, and some might even say as an excuse for some of his more creative choices. Emily Wilson's translation was used as justification for many of Nolan's creative choices that were revealed in the marketing. Yet, she noted in a recent interview while voicing her dissatisfaction with the adaptation, Nolan ended up flattening a character celebrated for his complex and paradoxical qualities. Emily Wilson told the Associated Press, "I want to celebrate the fact that so many more people are aware of the Odyssey and were brought back to the poem. But at the same time, I have the sense that Christopher Nolan was trying to pack everything in while missing themes that were essential to the poem." Homer's Odysseus is a man torn between his immense intellect and at times near suicidal pride. The entire structure of the Odyssey is built around demonstrating Odysseus' ability to navigate the world around him because he is so intelligent, but also his tendency to throw himself right back into trouble because of his pride. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus' journey home takes so long because he angers the gods, as well as the fact that he's constantly being distracted by the temptation to have the comfort and luxury that he thinks he deserves. Nolan chooses to abandon these traits. Instead of a hero undone by his own pride, Nolan's Odysseus is a man broken by a brutal war. His Odysseus isn't learning humility, he's just trying to survive. He is defined entirely by the belief that his own soul is too corrupted to ever re-enter human civilization, that he's not good enough to go home because of how he has allowed war to taint him. By centering the story on guilt and unworthiness rather than vanity and transformation, Nolan completely flips the moral architecture of the tale. Odysseus' greatest triumph in ancient mythology was the trick of the Trojan horse. In Nolan's Odyssey, it is reframed as Odysseus' greatest source of shame. It isn't Poseidon punishing him for his arrogance, it's his own psychological inability to allow himself to reach Ithaca. I think it's pretty obvious that Nolan was not interested in telling the story of a prideful Odysseus. Instead, he wanted to focus on an Odysseus that was so overcome with guilt that he had changed the very fabric of polite society. But the problem is that without hubris to master, the journey loses its transformational arc. If Odysseus doesn't actually transform as a human being over the course of his 10-year journey home, then the narrative ceases to be an Odyssey. Instead, we experience a 3-hour film where it seems like Odysseus suffers due to his own incompetence, learns nothing, and arrives home as the same guilt-ridden soldier. And even if we take Nolan as intention, do we see an intelligent contemplation about guilt and how the actions of Odysseus have led to the ruin of the moral fabric of society? Not really, because Nolan wants to keep the charm of Odysseus without any of the traits from the original work that made him charming. Other than exposition, we do not see the signs of a man torn apart by guilt. In fact, Nolan chooses to treat this idea almost like an M. Night Shyamalan twist. Other than throwaway lines of Odysseus not wanting to return home, we don't see any evidence of his journey plagued by his fear or unwillingness to return home to Ithaca. At least not until he ends up with Calypso eating lotus leaves. Compare this to how the other recent adaptation of the Odyssey, The Return, handles guilt and shame brought on from the ramifications of the Trojan War, and you realize how non-committal Nolan's Odyssey really is. Nolan wants to appeal to modern ethics and morality without the level of scrutiny that entails. Sure, Matt Damon ruined the world, but he feels really bad about it, so we shouldn't want him to beat himself up about it too much, and we still want him to get a happy ending because this is a summer blockbuster after all. In so many ways, Nolan is torn between trying to appeal to the profound while being hamstrung by appealing to the popular. Between epic grandeur and introspection, and in the process, does neither justice. One of Nolan's quirks as a filmmaker is that he hides behind ambiguity. This is beginning to feel less like an artistic decision and more like a defense mechanism. By refusing to establish definitive rules for his world, Nolan creates plausible deniability. If a plot point feels convenient, erratic, or illogical, the narrative shields itself behind the idea of subjective perspective, dream logic, or mythic interpretation. In The Odyssey, Nolan relies heavily on this technique by never answering the question, do the gods actually exist in this universe? In Homer's world, the gods aren't just background flair or metaphor. They are the active moral framework. They enforce cosmic balance, punish arrogance, and set the parameters for humanity. Nolan, true to form, seems completely non-committal. He refuses to decide whether he is making a high fantasy myth or a grounded psychological character study. Are Poseidon and Athena literal divine beings interfering in human affairs? Or are they merely hallucinations, a projection of Odysseus' fractured mind and crushing grief? Because the movie constantly hovers in this non-committal middle ground, Odysseus' journey ends up feeling completely aimless. Without a clear supernatural order or a grounded psychological reality, his struggles lose all stakes and purpose. And this non-committal stance bleeds into the tone of the entire film. Nolan is so terrified of romanticizing the legend, so terrified of accidentally showing Odysseus as a classic hero, that the entire movie turns overly prosaic. Nolan transforms an epic myth about monsters, magic, and divine intervention into a relentless 3-hour angsty guilt session. Instead of asking whether a sequence made logical sense, critics and viewers are debating which interpretation is correct. The debate itself creates a perception of depth, taking attention away from whether the underlying scene had a reason to exist in the first place. The scenes between Calypso and Odysseus are perfect examples of this. What should be a captivating mythic enchantment plays out like a high-strung existential therapy session. The scenes honestly remind me of Tony Soprano when he would lie down on a couch and start complaining about his mother. Just this time, it's Odysseus sitting on a beach, staring mournfully at the ocean, droning on about his trauma, while an ambiguously mystic figure tries to play shrink. In Nolan's interpretation, Calypso offers Odysseus the lotus instead of immortality. It's very clear that Christopher Nolan has commitment issues, whether it's The Odyssey, Interstellar, Inception, or The Dark Knight Rises. There's always an aspect of his films that are left open-ended, left open for interpretation. The existence of the Greek gods, the they in the 5D Tesseract, the spinning top, Batman's miraculous teleportation back to Gotham. The thing is, I think a lot of us love Nolan's films because they invite debate. He creates films that mean something different to everyone, which is not a bad thing. But when it comes to The Odyssey, there seems to be this desire to speak about it in absolute terms. It's either the greatest thing ever, or a complete piece of trash. Some people are so caught up in the visuals and the spectacle, while others are caught up in this idea that The Odyssey is promoting Christian values. Someone even spent 2 hours explaining how The Odyssey is actually a based anti-immigration film. And no, I'm not joking. So you can see how it is very easy for people to zoom in on one specific aspect or theme of The Odyssey and use it to reinforce the idea that The Odyssey is profoundly intelligent or profoundly awful, that it either reinforces everything they believe in or attacks it. When in actual fact, Nolan's Odyssey really makes no such commitment. Nolan's almost signature ambiguity invites the audience to vehemently defend ideas that Nolan puts very little effort into developing. It's almost like at this point, Nolan communicates through insinuations that only his most ardent supporters or detractors will understand. Over the past decade, Nolan's work seems to have shifted. Nolan seems to be obsessed with the horrors of war and the idea of men doing regrettable but necessary things and the toll that takes on them personally. In The Odyssey, Nolan tries to tackle the concept of Zeus's law, also known as Xenia, the sacred ancient code of hospitality. In Homer's world, Xenia is the fundamental law of civilization. You welcome the stranger into your home, you feed them, and you protect them. It is the invisible thread that keeps society from descending into total savagery. Nolan becomes hyper-focused on this concept and makes it the moral centerpiece of his film. The idea that kindness to strangers is the ultimate fabric of civilization, and that Odysseus' greatest sin was betraying those hospitality rules through a grand deception during the Trojan War. Nolan spends 2 hours building a didactic narrative on why deceit and breaking hospitality destroys the human soul, and then he hits the logical wall. And it's very similar to the question Socrates asked. Is a righteous action loved by the gods because it's holy, or is it holy because the gods loved it? So in other words, is morality determined by the gods, or does morality exist outside the gods and they simply favor that which is moral? It's impossible to have both, but that's the line that Nolan tries to tread. And this manifests in the gods' selective existence in Nolan's Odyssey. If Zeus's law is important and exists as a broad concept of morality, then the revelations and help of the gods makes no sense because Odysseus has corrupted this law. If the gods determine what is righteous, then their help of Odysseus getting home would suggest he's done nothing wrong and should feel no guilt. It's a perfect example of how applying modern thinking to a story specifically crafted around things like gods requires definitive choices be made. If you're non-committal, you undermine the very lesson you're trying to teach. It's the typical example of how sometimes the architecture and nature of a story do not suit a modern narrative, at least not without massive changes. And that is one of the greatest weaknesses of Nolan's story. Nolan feels structurally obligated to get Odysseus back to Ithaca to slaughter the suitors, but also hit all the highlights from the poem on the way there, whether they fit or not. So how does his hero, through exposition we learned is defined by his sense of guilt of breaking Zeus's law through the use of deception, resolve his story? He further breaks Zeus's law through deception, and in the process becomes yet another Trojan horse. Odysseus disguises himself as a helpless beggar, relies on the suitor's obligation to host him, gains access to their inner sanctum through that exact sacred law of hospitality, and then uses that deceit to launch a surprise massacre. The conclusion of the film actively relies on the exact same sin the movie spent 3 hours condemning. It completely undermines the moral lesson Nolan tried to teach us, turning his entire thematic structure into a mess. Nolan clearly wants to make a point about intergenerational trauma. He has Odysseus bar his son Telemachus from helping in the massacre, seemingly to keep his son's hands clean and preserve his moral purity. But look at what that actually says. By having the corrupted father commit the monstrous act alone so society can be restored, Nolan accidentally crafts a bizarre, highly cynical message. Civilized values are deeply important to maintain society, but you still need a brutal, ruthless man to break those values and do the dirty work when greater evil arises. For a film that desperately wants to deconstruct and undo the great man myth, the ending accidentally proves its necessity. The narrative ultimately shifts into a scenario where all the ethical posturing and lamentation become secondary. In the end, it demands a cold-blooded killer willing to step forward, violate established codes, and secure the final victory. It's actually quite silly, and kind of reminds me of the scene from The Sopranos when Tony is defending Christopher Columbus from the judgment of modern morality.
His history teacher, Mr. Cushman, is teaching your son that if Columbus was alive today, he would go on trial for crimes against humanity like Milosevic in, Europe.
It's not just my teacher, it's the truth.
He discovered America is what he did. He was a brave Italian explorer, and in this house, Christopher Columbus is a hero. End of story.
Nolan knows that most people want a hero. Sure, they might want to feel sophisticated by applying modern morality to Odysseus' actions, but not if that means we don't get to have the epic scene of him slaughtering the suitors or getting his happy ending. And this highlights the exact problem Hollywood is having right now with using source material as a hollow husk. There are certain classic stories that possess an inherent, immutable meaning hardwired into their narrative foundation. You cannot simply scoop out the insides of the Odyssey, insert your own modern anxieties, and expect things to still work like they used to. By trying to tell his own, completely unrelated story through Homer's structure, Nolan ends up with the worst of both worlds. A myth that fails as a classic hero's journey, and a modern anti-war statement that gets crushed under the weight of the very plot it's forced to execute. By the time we reach the climax, the film isn't just straining under its own contradictions. It completely unravels into pure melodrama. We watch an Odysseus who is literally riddled with arrows and bleeding from a dozen mortal-looking wounds after slaughtering the suitors, sitting down for a breathless conversation with Penelope about the end. The film frames this moment as one that should bring tears to your eyes. Penelope assumes, as any reasonable audience member would, that the end means he's about to die from his injuries. But no, he's fine. The end just means he has to go into exile, and this exposes the total narrative relapse of the third act. What ultimately did this guilt-ridden, trauma-plagued soldier learn from his 10-year journey to get home? What was the grand, soul-shaping lesson of his exile? Apparently, it's still best to lie to everyone, disguise yourself, and kill them all. His journey doesn't lead to enlightenment, spiritual growth, or a true homecoming. It's a relapse, masquerading as a cool IMAX action set piece, utterly devoid of the deeper meaning it desperately claims to possess. And look, do I understand what Nolan was trying to do here? 100%. I completely understand the message he's trying to convey about the complicated, deeply fractured feelings soldiers carry when returning home from a horrific war. I actually think that's a genuinely fascinating idea to explore in film. It just does not fit within the Odyssey. Nolan constantly has to talk past the core ideas of the Odyssey to tell his own story, all while paying empty lip service to the iconic plot beats of the original myth. Nolan clearly wants to have a sophisticated, modern conversation about cowardice, weakness, and alternative forms of strength, which is why he includes figures like Sinon and expands Telemachus' internal conflict. But because the movie is titled The Odyssey, he's still structurally locked into delivering the bloody Suitor massacre. He is forced to drag his guilt-ridden protagonist into a room and make him brutally murder dozens of men, completely shattering the thematic arc he spent 2.5 hours setting up. The core ideas Nolan wants to explore are actively fighting against the foundational ideas of the source material. And because those two frameworks are directly competing for survival, there isn't room for either of them to be done well. Nolan has built a film that has allowed the audience to select cafeteria style the film they would like to interpret. If you want to view Odysseus as a great man who has to do the hard thing to provide a better future for his son, sure, that's there. If you want to lean into Nolan's condemnation of Odysseus' actions and that he is unfit to rule, sure, he chooses exile. But the very flexibility that allows this vast degree of interpretation is indicative of a director not making definitive choices. Ultimately, Nolan's Odyssey isn't just a flawed adaptation. It is a textbook case study in modern Hollywood's deep-seated anxiety surrounding classic heroes. There is an overwhelming fear in Hollywood and contemporary filmmaking when it comes to depicting great, mythical figures. Studios and auteurs seem utterly incapable of presenting a classic hero who's flawed, arrogant, or larger than life without putting them on trial through a modern moral framework. Every mythic figure must be sanitized, dissected, or turned into a walking vessel of contemporary guilt to justify their existence to an audience. Nolan isn't doing this out of contempt for Homer. He isn't trying to vandalize the Odyssey. He is simply using Odysseus as a heavy-handed canvas for his own personal feelings about authority, leadership, and the lingering horrors of war. In doing so, he delivers the absolute logical evolution of his entire career. Odysseus becomes the ultimate Nolan protagonist, a grim, brooding figure who commits terrible, morally bankrupt acts for the greater good, only to spend the rest of his time pouting, brooding, and staring into the distance with a look of profound, self-important misery. He is Oppenheimer with a bronze sword, Bruce Wayne in a tunic. Except when you strip away Odysseus' vanity, his mythic hubris, and his desperate desire to reclaim his identity, you don't make him more human. You just make him flat. Nolan trades the underlying wisdom of the Odyssey for a meandering contemplation on Western morality, but is undermined by the trappings of a story never designed for that sort of reflection. Thank you so much for watching. We have upcoming videos about what's wrong with needle drops and how Nolan is baby's first real director. If that sounds interesting to you, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when they drop. And a special thank you to all of you who subscribe to the channel. Let us know what you guys think in the comments. And of course, a massive thank you to everyone who supports us here and on Patreon. Thank you, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.